Colleagues, thank you very, very much for returning so promptly again, which is much appreciated, keeping to time so well. I hope you've had a good lunch. I hope you've also had a chance to share some ideas and thoughts that have occurred to you over the morning session. It gives me great pleasure to be introducing a good friend and colleague, Chris Watkins. As many of you know, because Leeds has been one of the areas that Chris has done a substantial amount of work, there is no person alive in the United Kingdom who knows more about learning-centred classrooms than Chris Watkins of the Institute of Education. If there is, introduce her to me, please, because I've not met her yet. Huge pleasure.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
These four of them are sitting on these tables now.
That's where the expertise lies. Can we give a really big round of applause, please, to Chris Watkins?
Thank you very much, Barry, and more connections and introductions later on. It's great to be here. This is the post-lunch dip, colleagues. Do you know you get the post-lunch dip even if you didn't have lunch? Never mind. If you turn to page 2 of the original flyer, you'll see that the title at this point was this one here, Changing Schools, Changing Mindsets. So great to be at Leeds Met, to be thinking about those sorts of things with you this afternoon. The particular chunk that my presentation and your thoughts in this part of our day together were labelled as Building Learning Orientation in Classrooms and Schools. Yes, I come from one of those Welsh families that overproduced teachers all through the last century, Chris Watkins. Currently, I'm a reader in education at the Institute of Education. I say currently because I've been there in a range of different roles. The most relevant to today was that I set up the MA in Effective Learning there in 1999, and that was a brilliant experience working with teachers on their MA doing this. It led to me resigning because the issue that I learned most about through that was that what they were finding most challenging was not the ideas and the practices, but the context. So I wanted to work more with the context that I was learning about. So I work at the Institute of Education a day a week. The rest of my independent time, I've been operating with colleagues around the country projects on developing learning-centred classrooms and schools. In order to do that sort of independent work, as we're living in logo land, aren't we? Not Lego land, logo land. I have to have my own logo, so I'm currently using that one. Be an hell of a learner. Okay, if 3 people laugh, I'll carry on using it. And I particularly find that secondary school students laugh about that one. A particularly wonderful secondary school professional learning community down in Gosport. I walked into that school one day and it was on the wall. I thought, yes, it's spreading. Great. So great to be in Leeds. It's a real tingle for me, given the last couple of years, in that I have been greatly privileged to work with colleagues from 24 schools in Leeds in 2 projects. Yes, some of them are sitting here and noticing where their school is, just up on the top right-hand corner. And you'll hear some of their voices and the practices and activities coming into the picture later on. Great to see Carol in London, Birmingham and Leeds. It's great to be with her on this conference tour. It's great to see her again. When I first met her, it was in London. What's that, nearly 30 years ago? When she was doing a session invited by one of my favourite head teachers at the time. Okay, there's a message in itself. And having been somebody who had worked in behaviour in school, personal social education, all those sorts of fields that were getting sidelined at that time, to hear Carol talking in the way that she did was a really transforming experience. I found that the ways that I was understanding and puzzling about kids, their responses in school and those sorts of things really changed as a result. God, It's about how they view learning and how they view themselves as learners. Wow. And so since then, it's been one of the things that has interested me massively is to make more of that explicit. This is something which I'm popping up here as an early learning experience for me in that territory, because when I started to operate more independently and some schools invited me in to work on things like learning about learning and the classroom practices of that. I went to Greenwood School and the head said, oh yeah, could you work with my year one kids, my year one teachers, sorry. Well, I want to work with the kids, but I said to the teachers, we can be doing these sorts of things. Are you interested to do that? And they said, no, we're interested to see you do it. Okay, fine. So early starting activities on this journey, including for my own journey, might be starting to think about, I wonder what learners in our schools say when we ask them to talk about learning. This is something where me as a secondary trained maths teacher is working with some 5-year-olds, okay? And what I've done in this video clip is started it at the point where in their talk partners on the mat, they've been doing something, the first step of the activities to structure the activity and scaffold it. I've been asking them to tell each other as many examples as they can of things they've learned. So just before this clip starts, there's been buzz, 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 buzz. Examples of things they've learned. Now I'm going to do something different. Slow, isn't it?
There. Okay. Pause there. You've said lots of things to each other, examples of things that you've learned. Now I'm going to ask you to think really hard. I'm going to ask you to think like some grown-ups do. This is a very grown-up thing to do. Okay? Can you...
Do you see Ebo then? This is a very grown-up thing to do. Core.
Tell each other, can you explain to each other what the word learning means? What's your idea about what the word learning means?
As I'm saying that, I've got the last half century of child development voices in my head saying, you can't ask 5-year-olds that sort of high-level question. So I'm thinking, as plenty of teachers have told me when they're starting down this line, oh, it's not going to work, this. I'm thinking, oh, God, it's going to fall apart straight away.
Okay. Tell each other in your pairs, in your talk partners, try and explain your idea of what the word learning means. Okay?
They're off. And I'm sitting there with the experience then that plenty of teachers have told me about. I'm surprised. When you have one of those surprises, trace it back. What was the error in your prediction that led you to have that surprise? It's good territory, that. They're off. And in a few minutes' time, they're buzzing away, buzzing away. I do the thing of interrupting them. Yes, it works that way in primary schools, as we'll see shortly.
Good. Thank you very much for stopping. Now, we're not going to stop thinking. So let's all think together now while some of you say to everybody else what you think the word learning means. What's this word learning mean? Let's hear some of the things that you were just explaining to each other.
And Juliet, you just heard her there. She's just sitting on my right outside of the camera shot. That's really important for where we took it.
All right, yes, please all face the board so we can all hear. Lots of good listening. Right. Yes.
Learning means being good and not being naughty.
Does it?
Thank you, Ryan. Such rich learning from that. Juliet's face. Because this sort of experience, for me, is very important for all of us as teachers to be able to get to the point that afterwards Juliet was saying, blimey, what's been going on in my class such that somebody could end up with their view of learning like that? It was not her view as a teacher that that's what she wanted to be lived as the outcome of her classes. She ended up putting it in a really rich fashion that I remember. She said, the year one, I suppose we've socialised them into schooling and we haven't socialised them into learning. I thought that was a really rich way of putting it, because it does the thing that I'm interested to work with and have been privileged to do over recent years, the last decade, which is to say, what would we be seeing in schools that were doing that properly? Now, one of the things that I just wanted you to think about is, right at the end of that, I transcribed as many as of the different responses to that activity from this class as I could. And I've popped them up here in a particular order. I want you to do two things for a moment. One is to puzzle out and have a natter with each other just for a couple of moments. What's going on in the order I've put them in, but then start to do this thing that's supposed to be very difficult, transfer, and think about a class that you know and wonder what they might say in this territory. So here's the overall list from a bunch of 5-year-olds in Ealing. Why have I put them in this order? What sort of answers would you hear from a class you know? I got a sense of quiet thoughtfulness and quiet nattering nicely going around the tables. Let me interrupt it. Anybody want to say anything about the ordering that I've used, applied to the kids' responses there? Okay. Compliance. First view. First, then some ones where learning is being taught. That's the dominant cultural view that's around. Learning is being taught. Or as some researchers of how these things manage to stay over time when they shouldn't, who has it said, teaching is telling, learning is listening, knowledge is what's in books. That kind of picture is around for some of them. When Mrs. reading a book, you have to listen. But then, interestingly, I've grouped together ones that were outside of school. That was the theme of our next inquiry with them. How does learning work outside of school? And that's going to be really important for already some of the questions that have been coming up and also where we can go with this. But then already there are some which are collaborative and active. There are some where there's something you haven't done before in your learning. There's something about novelty in them. There are ideas of a potentially rich sort appearing for 5-year-olds as I get to the bottom. Now, I put them in that way in order to do two things. If you do this with any class, you will get a variety, and the variety is a resource. The order that I've put them there, for me, is the direction. And I call it nowadays going from thin views of learning to rich views of learning. So I can't categorize them. They're thin to rich. But it's a very important starting point for me, and in some of our projects, especially the ones with my colleague Jane Reed that have been operating in Sheffield, some of the schools there deliberately do this activity as the start of their journey and return to it later on. We'll hear some Leeds voices on that later. But starting off is really important because of the point I made about Juliet. As a teacher of a Year 1 class, she didn't want it to look like this. So I wasn't then in a position of having to convince her or change her. It didn't fit with her values as a teacher and her wishes as a teacher. That's really important in terms of change. Let's go back to these things then, because when it comes to developing learning-centered classrooms and schools, I do think of it as a journey of inquiring and getting richer conceptions of learning all the way. But one of the things that we have to do quite a bit of work on, more than I would have ever predicted once I started into this, was working out how come there are these views of learning that are nothing about learning going around. What's stopping us talking about learning? We have to get more effective at spotting those things and stopping them doing their dirty work. Okay? So we'll do a little bit of that in a moment, but then a few thoughts on a minor territory, changing classrooms. Two simple words. There's lots of lovely literature about that. I might get time, but as Barry was hinting earlier on, my time management is not good, so I might not get to these ones. You'll still have the slides on them if we don't. On that point of what gets in the way of talking about learning, when I did this piece for ATL a while ago called Learning a Sense Maker's Guide, I'm glad, particularly for somebody who's in the audience today, that I used the term space invaders. Space invaders, no, not just the computer game, showing my age, but let's use that term to think about the themes which take up the space which we would wish to give to a focus on learning. Have you ever had an experience like this in school where you want to, maybe with colleagues, maybe with kids, talk about learning and you find it's gone off elsewhere? Where does it go to? What are the space invaders that take the space we would wish to give to learning away? I've got three, and this is a quick little whip through of three. First one, teaching. And I've even known 10-year-olds say that to me. I say, you know, what stops us talking about learning? Oh, teaching. Right? So some of them have spotted it. I was spotting it with colleagues at the Institute when National Curriculum 1 led to a growth in the terms like teaching and learning strategies, teaching and learning policies, all that sort of talk started to increase. I didn't check today's list, but are any of you with that wonderful role title, Teaching and Learning Coordinators? Phew, great. They were yesterday. The interesting thing about those particular examples, if you look at them in detail, what you find is many would better call teaching and teaching policies, because the real amount of honest attention given to learning was often minimal in them. More important than that, though, I tried to pronounce the phrase properly. Teaching and learning policies, teaching and learning strategies. That's how it's pronounced, isn't it? Just like the phrase fish and chips, as though they go together, what discourse theorists call a cultural pair. Yeah, teaching and learning. Dream on. You know, there's the wonderful thing about our profession is we're trying to get teaching to lead to learning. So the small word, the and word, is the important word. And to squeeze it into an is a bit of a shame. I think what we have to do, and what a lot of the colleagues that I know working in this territory do, is make sure that they can separate them, think about each of them clearly. So we've got to take them apart for a moment. in order to think about each of them more clearly, and that's where Carol's work is wonderful for helping us think about lots of the dynamics of learning. So there's a great contribution there. But then, once we thought about teaching and learning more effectively, we'll be able to put them back together, not as a space invader, but as a better articulation. Here's a tiny little activity I want you to try a snippet of, which is something that I found can help in this territory, which is I'm going to pop a question up there. I'm not so much interested in your answer, it's just where it takes your thinking. So when I pop the question up there, have a little thinking and noticing where your thoughts go, and then a brief sharing of one or two of those with the person next to you. Here's the question. Okay, stop. That was different, wasn't it? Sorry to interrupt, but no, I'm not actually sorry, because did you know the evidence on interruption? The Zeigarnik effect from way back in the 1920s. When human beings are interrupted in an activity, they find themselves more motivated to continue it. So I'm hoping you will say, oh, I want to talk more about this back at the ranch or whatever, but even in that short time, what sort of issues and clarifications popped up in your thoughts and conversations? Anybody want to mention any? Oh. Yes, that's a quick way to get people into a mindset of the worst sort, is some of the way that teaching observation is handled at the moment. A wonderfully creative teacher in one of the Dover projects I was running last year said, when I'm observed, I shrink. Oh, dear. And she was quite the opposite when not observed, but because of the way it's handled. Fascinating theme, that one. Keep it on the ball for the next activity as well. Anything else people noticed?
We wanted it to be the first one, but we thought probably it was more likely the second one.
Oh, right, okay. So you wished for an answer that would give the balance between those two, more towards the first. Great, okay. Anything come up in your conversation about that balance that you want to mention? Because I'm glad you've put your wishes in the picture too, because a lot of what we're doing is reminding ourselves of what we're striving for against the space invaders as teachers. So great. The picture you want, I'm glad to hear you identified that. The other bit that I'm sort of searching for is something I don't usually have to search for. Even I'm now practiced in putting this on the screen. I look at it in order that nobody can catch my eye. Because normally when I pop that on the screen, somebody catches my eye and says, yeah, but hang on a minute, where do you mean? Anybody find themselves thinking? Some nods around the table. One of the things that I often find as a result of this is people say, do you mean in school or not in school? And that's wonderful and important because It reminds us that we all know something about ourselves as human beings, which is we all vary in contexts. Okay? You don't have to be convinced of that. Just look at you now. You don't behave like this in the bar. Same with me. I know some of you don't believe it, but I do not behave like this at home with my partner in front of the kitchen table doing this sort of thing. But our views of ourselves, our views of what's appropriate activity vary across situations. And that's a really rich theme that we can get into, is to say, well, where does the teaching without learning happen? Where does the learning without teaching happen? What's going on differently in those? Can we learn from one and bring it into the other to shift the balance? Somebody was, yes.
We were just saying, though, actually in early years, you see a lot more of that, don't you? So a lot of it is because of, you know, we encourage much more child-initiated learning in early years, and that, you know, does go as children get older and as the curriculum becomes more packed, I think.
It does. The balance shifts for reasons which are long-standing and spurious, right? And that will come up again in the next Space Invader. The culture of learning in our classrooms is rich, connected, and so on in early years, even though you do get some funny ideas like, oh, children are always learning. Well, no, not yet. But it changes as the years go on. Why? Right? Because that's where our education system as a selection system takes over from it being a learning system. Diving on, I'm happy to talk about these things with parents, as I've had opportunities to do in coffee mornings in some of the Waltham Forest schools and so on, because I know that this theme is talked about not just between us. I taught Stripe out of whistle. I don't remember whistle. What was that I taught him? And talking with parents about that connection, do they know times when they learnt without teaching? What do they find about themselves as a learner? Did they apply any of that to the times when they were being taught and so on? Is rich territory. So I will often pop in a cartoon in order to carry the message that these things are being talked about out there. That cartoon would have been in about 20 newspapers at the time. If you just put, I taught Stripe how to whistle into an internet search engine, you'll find a lot of people using it. So that sort of thing emphasizes for me that we should be talking about it more. Space Invader 2 is one that we're talking about in current times. It's a more recent Space Invader. Because what have we got now? We've got performance tests, we've got performance tables, and we've got performance management. It's a right performance, isn't it? And just putting it that way is a brief way of saying, what does all of that do to the stance that we find ourselves in? Okay, oh, it's a right performance. I've got to cope with it. I've got to be a performer and those sorts of things. Now, very importantly for me, we have to spot what this Space Invader does to the view of learning. The problem is that a performance view and some of the voices that have been over the last decade or more, in this country, been influencing the culture of our schools. So who has it said, how does one learn as a human being except through pressure and threat? Chris Woodhead wrote that in The Spectator in about 2003, I think it was. Thank you very much, Chris, for giving us such a nugget to demonstrate what view of learning is carried by some of the people who are saying that's what it's all about now, okay? And of course that P word, pressure, ends up having very, maybe your point about observation, has very important things to say about relationships inside our system. And the pressure word shows that if we think, okay, I've got to get some more performance out of them, I know how to do it, I'll just put some pressure on them. Okay? And a nugget on that one I heard some while ago. Who said this? We're putting the teaching pressure on a lot of pressure. We're doing it for a simple reason. They're all the people putting us under pressure. Tony Blair said that in about 2002. I heard it on the radio, didn't believe it, just had to wait an hour, then round it came again. Lovely nugget again of the pass it on theory. If you're under pressure, pass it on. And I was starting to notice that different words, all beginning with P, were characterizing what was going on under this Space Invader, but also, more importantly for me, its effects. So I put the words together in this article, and funnily enough, in another Leeds hotel just last year on the National Assessment Conference, I got my slides wrong, so I had to say it. Let me see if I can say it again. These P words. Politicians' propaganda over performance leads to policies which exert pressure on schools who pass it on to pupils. The effects are plateauing of performance improvements and the polarization of the pupil population in which the privileged continue to prevail. Thank you. Now, I normally pop it up there, but your applause will allow us to zip past that and say to people, does this ring any bells for your experience, some of your experience, not the whole picture, of the current culture and pressures on our schools? And it's very important for me to spot that in the second sentence there, the effects of this are being shown in what's happening to the UK education system, and something which learning-centred schools don't have going on in them, which is that polarisation. In terms of where UK nowadays comes in the data on how much of the range of school performance is explained by things like social class differences, where do they come? That's the picture in one of the OECD studies in 2009. All those countries, not just OECD ones down the side, you can't read it because there's so many of them. Where's UK on that list? Well done. Yeah. Right next to the bottom, close to the United States, where many of these practices were first generated, but that's again a thing that I know is not what teachers want. Did any of you get into the profession in order to sort out sheep from goats? No. So that Space Invader needs working on, and also it's one we can talk about. The Cambridge Review said a state theory of learning has been imposed. Is that it? I've had great experiences talking about that sort of thing with parents, because a number of them are saying, I remember after a school inset day going back to the station, being taken by one of the governors of a school down in Greenwich, and him saying, oh, you know that stuff you were talking about performance and learning and those sorts of things, exactly the same in my business. He happened to be selling tyres. So there are parallels and conversations we can have more widely outside of here. If you listen to many of the parents who've been talking most at length about things like the Staffordshire Hospital, responses to pressure and those sorts of things, they're really richly onto what's wrong with this. And so you must get that talked about more widely. But that's where, for me, Carol's work, and I use some of the terms that Carol was using earlier on to say the difference between a learning orientation and a performance orientation is so important. That's where we can square the circle about performance pressures and a learning stance. Because, as Carol was clarifying earlier on, it's not a matter of you're one or the other. You could be in different situations down this end of the continuum on some, or on that, say up here, oh yes, when I'm having conversations with my colleagues about how I'm understanding my own learning, might be down here. When I've got somebody coming along to do their observation of my class, might be down here. So each one of us might be in different ones, but the very important aspects of it that Carol's work and others too have helped us be clear. When we're in a learning orientation, we believe effort, not any old effort, not that wonderful phrase, deliberative effort, smart effort. We believe in our ability to improve and learn. We want challenging tasks, and as Barry was saying, the operationalization of that word challenge is interesting. It's when you believe that there's a 50-50 level of risk that it could go either way. Oh yeah, why do you like that when you're in a learning orientation? Well, because then which way it goes is down to what you do. Yes, you'll learn from it. We get satisfaction from personally defined success. Sometimes when I invite people to review and think about their own best experiences of success, it turns out that many of them are in fields where nobody else knew. Your personal definition is very important, but they may not be, all of them, examples where anybody else knows that you're thinking, yes, done it. Okay? So personal definition. Last but not least on this side, this one has given me a decade of work, which is when you're in a learning orientation, you talk to yourselves. You're not daft, you're not crazy, it's what effective learners do. You talk to yourselves, noticing what you're doing while you're doing it, in some thin or thick way, narrating that to yourself as you go. This gets you into all of the wonderful territory that in psychology might be called metacognition or meta-learning. You notice what you're doing while you're doing it, and that talking yourself through allows you to rise above it. That's one of the key things for me in helping people with the features of effective learning, becoming more able to notice your learning as it's going, and as you rise above it, being able to take the directions that you want to take in it. When you're in the performance orientation, you believe that ability leads to success. We want to be seen as able, what do the others think of me? You seek satisfaction from doing better than others. You're sitting down with one of your students talking about something that they're creating at the moment, and at the end of your conversation they say, oh, thanks very much, miss, how are the others doing? They're in the comparative mindset then. We might emphasize competition. I'm not necessarily against, in some funny way, competition, but when you're in a performance orientation, that's all there is. Okay? The great thing about many competition things is that the people who achieve most highly in them, especially some of my favourite sporting achievers, turn out to be not so much emphasising the competition, they're emphasising themselves as high-level performers in the way that they have learned how to do it. I recently had the privilege to work with David Hemery. Anybody ring a bell, that name? Gold medal in the Mexico Olympics, way, way back. He uses two wonderful photos. I was thinking of sliding them in here, but my time management's not up to it. One is of him standing on the dais getting the gold medal for the 400 meters hurdles, I think it was. And then he says, on paper, before that race started, I and my other colleague from England were the last. Okay. So I'm standing and thinking, wow, is it really me? Is that right? So he talks about how he was thinking about himself. Then he shows a photo of himself at school. A class photo. Down the front, there's a puny little kid that all sorts of teachers would start giving medical descriptions to, and he did have some major concerns, but the fact that this puny little man has now written 4 wonderful books and achieved all of those sorts of things and runs a great scheme of connecting up schools on this sort of thing really impressed me. And you know what happens when people are in a performance orientation and things get tough, can't do it. Kids in my maths class now and again can't do maths. My dad couldn't do maths. I don't think his dad could do maths. They'll give you all sorts of maybe big stories, but the key thing is they've gone clunk. They've gone into, it's not me. Now, this framework helps us square the circle, helps us stop the space invader being believed much more, because especially at the way that Gregory Shaw put it, the left-hand side it is a concern for improving one's competence. The right-hand side is a concern for proving one's competence. Okay? And for me that too rings good connections, that sometimes if we are concerned to achieving competitive context, we might need some of each, but what's known is in fields of commerce and industry, in fields of sport, and in fields of education, which one of these is associated with highest levels of performance? The left-hand one. I spent 18 months doing the research review on learning performance improvement, where that was the guiding light, and comes on page 1, and put together, there are about 100 classroom studies now of what makes the difference inside a classroom. When that got published, one of the national newspapers gave it the headline, "Pupils do better if teachers are not fixated on test results." Okay? Now, I'm not so good at writing headlines, so I've put those two phrases together. The twin phrase, a focus on learning can enhance performance, a focus on performance can depress performance. Tell each other for 30 seconds in pairs whether that twin phrase rings bells to any of your experience, either of yourself or learners you know. I hope Zeigarnik effect works again. I hope you continue carrying on the real relationship between learning and performance, both amongst you as professionals and with others around you, including parents, because they have rich things to say, in my experience, about that. Space Invader 3, what's the four-letter word that you hear in classrooms when you listen out for the word learning? Get on with your work. Have you finished your work? Please, miss, he's copying my work. Secondary school example, that was a good lesson. We didn't do any work. Okay. What does that do? I'll hear a voice on that later. It turns into a view of what your role is. Oh, I'm a worker in here. And when I say that, I notice my shoulders start sagging. Okay. I'm a worker, not a learner. Changing from work to learn is one element in all of this. This is some posters that some of the Ealing schools had in the picture in their classrooms. Work-free zone, we're here to learn. Some of you are thinking, gosh, that goes too far. When you're changing a dominant culture, you sometimes, as one step in the journey, have to do a little bit of that. The parents of this particular class said, I see you stopped giving homework. Yes, have you remembered your home learning? When the teacher explained, the parents said, gosh, yes, we think the kids are going to like that. They could get a sense of the way that the change of language changes the climate and the relationships. Down at Pudsey Primrose Hill School, the head there knew that there was quite a need to do this, ran a whole school assembly one day and said, okay, everybody, from here on, from this Monday morning, here at Pudsey Primrose Hill School, no more work. From today onwards, it's all learning. she said that when the assembly finished, the Year 1 kids ran back to their classroom and said to their teacher, "Is it true? Is it true?" Their excitement at that change of language is something I'd love to be able to research more. And they could spot the difference that the different language culture would have created. When you think about the space invaders, you might recognize them, but you might also have experiences of keeping them at bay. That's what we as the professionals need to do nowadays. So I hope that as one step in the journey, and I've given more time to it than I probably should have done, but that's what the current times are like. That's one of the things we need to get better at. Oh, sorry. That's another thing we need to get better at. What's that? Old black and white photo taken in 1934, first published in 1938. Yes, it's the earliest known classroom on the face of the planet. Where was that then? How long have we had classrooms in this planet? Sumeria, 3000 BC. That amazing area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which the Greeks called Mesopotamia, before that Acadia, before that Sumeria. So we've had 5,000 years worth of classrooms. I've got in my bag over there, but I haven't got it to hand, an exercise tablet from that classroom. 4 rows of signs. The teacher did rows 1 and 2, said to the kids, okay, you do 3 and 4. Then what happens? I'll come and correct you, turn it over, do some more. Does that ring any bells? Okay. Because it's one of the dynamics of classrooms that stays around. It's called the IRE cycle, and researchers all over the world have said, hey, it's a dominant feature of classrooms even in different country cultures. So it's very important that we say, rather than, let me give you a short example, 6 sixes. Good boy. Okay, that's, I'll initiate, you'll respond, I'll evaluate. We need to turn all that over so that you're initiating some more, I'm having to respond, and you're evaluating. Those shifts in the changing classrooms are really important. And they've been changing in this country too. Here's some evidence from Campaign for Learning, where they have been giving secondary school students that list and saying, which do you do most often? I don't know a researched answer to why that's been changing in that way, but when I ask secondary school teachers, they say, well, it's probably national strategies and PowerPoint. Okay? So what's happening under current pressures is classrooms are reverting into a teacher-driven version. And the way of moving on from that I'm finding people find effective on their journey is not to talk about the dominant patterns, but to talk about best experiences. There's a whole approach to change that we've been talking about called appreciative inquiry, which says, identify in detail some of your best experiences, analyze how they happened, then think about what would need to happen for more of those to occur. Okay? It's a rich and detailed and wonderfully challenging way of going about things. If I was to do it with you, then I'd be able to say, okay, think of a time when you were in the classroom where learning, not so teaching performance worked, the learning was, wow. Push the boundaries, think of the best that you can, and then analyze for yourself what was going on, how come it happened that way, and how you're able to talk about that, because it won't be the dominant talk. My experience of doing that with people is one where they want to talk more and more with each other, and interestingly, in contrast to many teacher conversations, I don't find they get into conflict. It's not the conversation that leads to, oh no, that's not how classrooms are. It leads to agenda building. My contribution sometimes is to come along with some dimensions and ask them to say, whether these dimensions relate to their best experiences of learning in classrooms. These were ones that my colleagues and I worked on for a long time to try and reflect adequately all the research in this field, but also in a way that was talkable about by us as professionals, active. Yeah? It's not running around, it's the activity is part of it, but being an active learner, actively processing the doing to review, to learn and apply is one of the things that characterizes active learning. And I've had phenomenal experiences of just putting that diagram in front of even 8-year-olds and saying to them, can you talk to each other for a moment about what you've just been doing using those words? Wow, they can narrate their experience doing it. Collaborative. We sit around tables talking with each other. We're not necessarily collaborating, we're cooperating, that's fine. We're collaborating when together we create something we couldn't have created separately. So there's only one task in the middle of that little picture there. And it's shown internationally. Some Italian researchers have just analysed the PISA studies with data they've got on people's attitudes towards collaboration. Yes, better attitudes towards collaboration get better results. Third one, we use the phrase learner-driven in order to try and pick up lots of things like self-regulated learning and agency in learning, because the idea there under that everyday phrase is that somebody thinks, oh yes, I'm going somewhere with this, so I've got a bit of an idea where I might end up, but the key thing is I've got my hands on the wheel. Learning focused. That's when you start to be able to notice learning, talk about learning, have conversations that help you rise above and get your learning to be better. I don't have a great image for that, but other than this little 5-year-old in a 1950s desk going, that was interesting the way that went. I wonder how we'll do it next time. So when I say to people, do the first 3 of those relate to your experience of classrooms at their best for learning, I invite them to show me by putting their hands up. Beginner teachers, they're a problem, aren't they? No, their experiences, their best experiences of classrooms are like that. That's PGCE students at Goldsmiths. What about head teachers? Yes, there's a couple of weeks ago the head teachers of West Berkshire. There's the ones from Surrey, including one who shouldn't have been there. So, as a profession, even inspectors, the first time I did it, that's the Inspection and Advisory Service of Essex, even across the world, secondary head teachers from Guangdong, oh, the translation went wrong, so when I asked them to do that, and they did what you've just done, they smiled and laughed with each other. It was not only agenda building in terms of its content, but it was value building for them. So appreciative inquiry about your best experiences of learning in classroom, know that for me, it affirms every time that the profession, all of you, know the key things that are going on in it. Getting those to work and getting more talk about it amongst your whole school staff, yes, maybe even them, maybe even secondary schools where in this case not much of it's happening, but instead of thinking, oh gosh, I've got to go back and change their minds, collaboratively moving the agenda on through appreciative inquiry is one of the things that I've just popped that in as one of the activities with teachers. And we could do it with students as well. Don't have time for that, but helping people get better at narrating their journey is one of the things that we might be able to do to help them say more about, well, before you go anywhere, what are you going to ask? When you're on the road, how's it going? What are you going to ask? And at journey's end. I'm rushing through this only to get to some of the things from colleagues in Leeds, where helping kids talk more about themselves as learners and the journey of learning ends up with very rich things going on. There's Beth down the road at Carlton, who had all of this as a display on the wall of her classroom. You can see a little road sign up there. The kids ended up wanting to create their own road signs. And this one, be prepared to make juicy mistakes, reflects something that Beth had to do as a transition thing. Kids being frightened of mistakes, she ended up as a transition giving stickers to kids who made juicy mistakes. What's a juicy mistake? One that we can all learn from. Great, let's hear more about those. Super. So here's Donna reviewing the journey in Strawberry Fields.
Well, two more questions, I think. What's the difference between learning and work? What's the difference between those two words, do you think? Or is there no difference? Do the two words mean the same? Harrison, you're desperate to tell me. Tell me what you think.
Because when you work for someone else, and when you learn for yourself and do different things and all like that.
Thank you, Harrison. Eloise?
Well, I don't think there is a difference because when you're working, you still, like if you're a teacher, you can learn off your students.
So you mean I come to work, but I'm still learning at work?
Yeah.
Is that what you meant by that? So yes, there's no difference between me working because I'm learning with you.
In that snippet from that review conversation where Donna was particularly testing out how the Space Invaders were with the kids, I think those two responses are wonderful. The second one in particular, we almost said, hey, that's a good enough criteria for a learning-centered classroom, is that the kids think that the teacher is learning with them and from them. Last tiny little bit, very importantly, you'll see a little article in your pack which is about practices and themes for helping kids more richly narrate their own learning. You won't see the examples of kids talking about times when they took charge of their learning, their wonderfully rich self-talk that their teachers had no idea there was going on. So it's hearing their voice as learners more clearly, and the results went up very happily that year. What makes the difference is how learning is talked about too by the teachers themselves. If you're in a learning-oriented classroom, one that creates learning orientation and growth mindset, it's how teachers talk about learning, and including how they talk about their own learning. Helen Patrick and that team were surprised at the strength of that result, including how we introduced learning to people. I won't have time for this, but the fourth heading I left separately because you have to go through one part of the journey first, which is the shift from teacher-centered towards more learner-centered classrooms. That's why I asked people only to think of the first three together, because it's only when some of that's in place that you can get towards the real focus on learning. If you try and add learning language to a classroom which is basically still teacher-centered, and therefore the kids don't view themselves as learners, they're going to be sitting there thinking, hello, teacher's been on a course? No, because somebody else's language will come from left field. It's not until they've got a lived sense of themselves as learners that we can do that. Performance is a bonus. Here's a wonderful school in Sheffield, Woodthorpe. It's a place where the learners are composed, and it's in one of those mid areas of Sheffield where the old National Coal Board estates are. It's a lost area in that sense. The centre of Sheffield's busy, the outside has had development. These folks have, and look what's been happening to their scores since they started to become learning-centred. The wonderful head teacher there said he was looking at this office window one day, seeing everybody come to school and thought, hello, the kids are coming to learn and the teachers are coming to teach. There's the problem. And Christo and the colleagues who have finished up say, what we're seeing in our learners now is the increased number of high attainers. To be honest, this is a position a few years ago we could have only dreamt about. Thank you, Louise, for sending me your whole presentation, out of which I've just picked a couple of slides. Grimsdyke is one of the least privileged areas of outer or middle to outer Leeds. 2006 special measures, plenty of interventions. Staff found themselves jumping through hoops, okay? Boy, interesting combination of things came along. So building on the project, what's happening now? This is what Louise was sending me last week. I love that one. And in the results term, the bonus is whoosh in terms of the results as well. And I've deliberately used that word bonus because if we end up over-focusing on them, we don't get it. If we focus on learning, they're the bonus. I think I'd better stop there, Barry, hadn't I?
Colleagues, I think you get a sense of the wealth of experience and passion that comes from Chris's immersion in learning. Can we give him a really warm round of applause? We will be short applause, so
talking as soon as we came into the room. I'm sitting down with some kids in a school.
Yeah. I wonder if you notice it.
I've said to them, already in this school I'm hearing you using a word.
There's a lot of talk in this school about a very funny word that we don't hear in all schools.
Learning.
See that? This one, just there. He said, learning?
Oh, yes.
Work.
What
Learning.
Oh, yeah.
Right, that's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
You would expect schools to talk about learning quite a lot, but we find that some of them don't.
They say, well, how do you not talk about learning if you're in school?
Yes. That's the question. How do you not talk about learning if you're in school? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Colleagues, we're going to save any questions that you might have for Chris in our Q&A panel. We're going to be moving straight into our refreshment period. I will ask if we can still keep us close to 3:05 for our resumption. So a quick break. By all means, do bring some tea, coffee back in with you, and we'll start as close to 3:05 as possible. Thank you again.